Hey Titans, this is Mordecai from GamerTitan.com. In this video, we're going to be going over how to set up a UI in your core game. So first, we're going to go ahead and hop into the core editor here. And I should mention, as always, if you haven't done so already and you would like to create your own games in core completely free, go ahead and use the link in the description down below. It's my affiliate link. You can sign up completely free to core. Core is always free to create and free to play. By signing up, you can hop in and create your own games as well. I've been using it for quite some time and it's awesome. I have been using it every day and love it. So to actually go over UI, we need to understand what is UI. So first, UI is only seen to the player. So the UI actually is rendered on the player's computer. And so every player, even though they could be seeing the same UI, they're going to be seeing completely different things. So for example, if you set up a UI that shows that player's gold, well, it doesn't make much sense for all the players to see one player's gold. You want them to individually see their own gold. So to do that, how to set up an actual UI is in core content. There is a game under game objects here is UI elements. So if you click on UI elements, these are all the various elements that we can use in core currently at the time of filming this video. So anytime you're going to make a UI, you need to start with a UI container. So when you drag a UI container into your hierarchy, you'll see this orange box that goes around your viewport. That means that you have the container selected. Now, the container itself doesn't really do anything for us other than all of our objects that we create with the UI needs to be a child of the UI container. The other thing is it will allow us to, if we hide the visibility of the container, it will in fact hide the visibility of all the UI underneath it. So before we go any further, however, as I was mentioning before, we want to make sure that our UI is on the client. And the reason we want it to be on the client is, like I said, we want each player to see their own UI and be able to interact with the UI without impacting other players. So to do that, we right click on the container, we do create network context, and then we select new client context containing this. And now it'll create this what looks like a group or a folder icon. It's considered a client context, and as a child of it now is this UI container. So this is how you properly set up just the basics of getting your UI set up. So the next thing we want to learn is what a UI panel is. So if we put a panel in, we'll see that there's this little box in the top left corner. And the reason it's in the top left corner is because its anchor and its dock is to the top left corner. So this is very important to understand, because if I had this anchor as top left and I just moved it here, say that I wanted it to be in the middle of my screen, but the anchor was the top left, as I scale, each players have different screen resolutions. And so what looks great on your computer by dragging it in the middle there, if someone else had a different resolution, if you don't have it anchored properly, then it wouldn't line up properly because it would be staying where it is compared to the top left anchor of that person's screen. So another trick is to reset. Because we moved the offset, we could just click this revert to default and it'll go back up into the top. So the proper way to do this is, if we wanted to say have it in the middle of our screen, what we would do is we'd want to actually change the anchor and we'd want to change the dock to middle center. And I wanted to show this first because if you don't understand this, you'll get very, very weird things happening that when I first did it, I didn't understand what was going on and it was quite frustrating. So now that we have this UI panel, just like the container, we basically were going to use the panel for each cluster of UI for our game. So I guess a better way to explain that is, say that we had a health bar, then I would make one panel for the health bar, and then say that we had like coins down here in the bottom right, then I'd have another panel and I would put all the UI elements that I need for there. That way it's a way to separate it, because panels also, to hide the UI or to turn it off, you could turn off the UI panel and it would turn off that element. So without doing too much theory, I'll continue actually showing. So the next thing is, right now our UI, it's transparent, right? We only have this box and we're not really sure what it is yet. So what we do is we could take an image here, and the reason we want to start with the panel is because we make this UI image a child of it. And then what I personally do is I inherit the parent height and width. So now this lines up directly with the size of the panel. And so now if we select the panel and we resize it, the UI image that is our background resizes with it as well. And so that's one option for you. The other option is you just leave it separately, but then if this image is getting a different width and height, and this panel, see how it's clipping right here, the image, if for whatever reason we wanted this at the bottom center and we anchored the panel down there, it's anchored based on its height and width. So there's still more UI image, but it's outside of that panel now, and so it's getting clipped. And so we can see that by dragging it up slightly. You can see that it's right there. So that's just one thing to take a note of. So I usually will have an inherent, let me make this slightly bigger for you, inherent parent width and inherent parent height. And then what I do is I'll just have, just some form of working space where, this may not be the color that you want for your UI, but at least the dimensions currently of your panel. And if you need to, you could then resize the actual panel by having that background. So another thing that I suggest is actually naming your panels what the UI is planned to be. And so, say that you wanted to have it for player currency, then I would name it player currency panel. And that way you can kind of determine, all right, what is this panel for? What's all of the UI that's inside of it? And then what I do is I make the UI image, the first one that I make it the background. So I guess I'll go through a few more of these custom properties. So in the panel, the other option we have is, as we noticed, when we moved this panel down to the bottom, it cut off the image, but it technically wasn't cut off. It was actually hidden because it was outside of the viewport. So what we could do is we can actually turn this back off so it actually bleeds over outside of the panel. And we'll go back to the panel one more time, and there's another option for us that allows us to clip children. And what that does is anything that's outside of the panel, it'll actually be clipped. So as an example, as I move this, you'll see that's actually clipping the image, but the image is in fact larger. Its height is 200 while our panel is only 50. So that's what clip children does. The other thing to know is if you're using inherent parent width and inherent parent height, the other option you can do, oops, I did that on the panel, do that on the background, is if you add size to self, that's another way that, say that you did want the image to be slightly outside of the panel, or maybe you wanted it to have like a border around the actual panel, you could actually add a couple pixels, to the width and height, and then you would center it. So then it would actually come out over the panel slightly. That's kind of more used for frames, so I guess I'll do that demonstration again, but with something that you would actually do it with. But inherent parent width and height, and then adding size to self allows you to, it sets whatever the width and height is to whatever the parent is, and then it adds whatever you add into the width to that size, and you can do negative values as well. So that's one way that you can use like background frames and stuff like that. So we'll go ahead and turn that off for now. We'll make this back to a square. And I guess I'll so you guys can see better. I'll try and make this larger. Okay, so going back to the images, we actually still haven't done an actual image yet. What we've done is we just set a color, but there's also images in Core. And so under image, if we just click on this Polaroid looking icon, it'll bring up all of the various images that we have access to currently in Core. And there's quite a bit of them. So there's a few that are actual images, but then there's also ones that are more for like setting up multiple layers of your own. So as an example, say that we wanted to make a rounded corner, we could go ahead and select this. And then one thing we could do is we could copy this background image and then we can make it a frame. So there's also frames. So we could type in frame and we made it rounded at the corner. So what we could do is we could take this one, we can make it white so we can see it. And that looks a little bit better. And the reason this worked so quickly is because both of these are inheriting their size from this top panel. So that makes it extremely easy to use. One thing I should have mentioned is we have been moving, once again, this anchor around. So we'll move this to middle center again. And we'll change the offset so it's actually sitting in the center of our screen properly. So the anchor for the parent panel is in the center of our screen, but there's also the ability to anchor children elements of this panel, and they can have different anchors, but their anchor point starts with the panel. So a great example is if I add another image, see how this image is, it's this white square right here. Its anchors to the top left. If we were to anchor the panel, its anchor is within the container, and so it would anchor to the top left of the container, while the anchor for the image now is the top left of this panel. So that makes it so, once again, if we wanted, we could offset this image, say 15, and then do 15 here, and that makes it a lot easier to work within the UI, is to use these offsets and use these anchor points, because then as if someone's screen resolution is different, as you can see, it always remains in the middle of the screen with this panel, but this one is anchored to the top left. So very similar to the background. One thing we'll probably want to do is clean stuff up a bit. So one thing I should note is if we just started adding a ton of elements underneath this panel here, it would get kind of messy. And so one thing to note is it's also a good idea. You have your parent panel here, which is, I guess I should name it parent panel since that's what I'm used to calling it. But then we have a lot of these other UI elements, and if we keep adding these, it's going to get pretty unorganized. And so traditionally in Core, if we were using 3D objects, we would just go ahead and group things up or use folders depending on what our goals were. But if we do that with UI, so as an example, if I take these two background images and I make them a group, you'll notice that they get messed up. And that's one reason you want to try and avoid using groups inside of the actual structure of the UI. So instead, just like that parent panel, what we can do, let's go ahead and change that back. We could actually create another panel, and we would make it a child of the parent panel there, and then we would inherit size from the parent. And then what we could do is we can move all this stuff underneath that panel, and so that allows us to do some cleanup. So as an example, we could do, let's call it background panel just to keep it things named properly. And then we'll name that one frame. And so one thing I do suggest is definitely name your stuff as you go, because nothing is worse than going back to try and change something and having 30 different things say UI image and having no idea where it's at, right? So I guess I should mention one other thing. There is a tool that allows you to click on specific UI parts of within Core. So up here in the top right corner is this UI editing mode. So if you click on this without selecting a container or anything, you'll notice that this orange box is back. And so what it allows us to do is if there's anything in the foreground, we can click on it and it'll actually select the UI element as opposed to, you know, whatever 3D object is in the background. So for example, if I turn this off and I aim this down and I click, you'll notice that I technically clicked this background right here of the UI element, but because I don't have that UI editing mode selected, it actually selected the ground behind the UI. So to do that again, we'll click it. You'll know it's on when this is orange. We'll click this, and now we selected the frame. So one thing to note, which is why it's important to name your stuff, is this is a perfect example, is I actually clicked on this black beveled edge rectangle right here, which is the background, but what it actually selected is the frame, which is one layer above it. And so that's where things get a little iffy if you don't know. Like, you could obviously just cycle through this way and kind of tell, but like I said, just make sure as you're going to name your stuff. So a good practice to keep your stuff organized is to just continuously make panels. And so we'll just call this like items panel. And then what we'll do is we'll put that under there. So now it's a bit cleaner. So you know that this is, you know, the actual main background and everything. And then this is, for example, our items. So we name this like item 1. And then once again, just use the UI. The Core recently released a lot of like cool fantasy icons and stuff like that, which look really good. And so there's that, there's survival, there's a lot of assets and they're always adding more. So it's very cool. So we'll go ahead and use this, let's see. Yeah, we'll go ahead and just use a sword for now. So, and I wish I could hide the chat, but I can't that I know of. Actually, I can move it. All right, there we go. So we need to make that the same. So the other thing to note is now that we have this other panel, if we started making items, what we could do is we'll actually use this inherent size from self. And this is where I'll use like the negative values for offset. So what that does is I removed 50 pixels from the height and the width. And as you can see, the items panel, even though it is anchored to the parent panel and it's inheriting its size, it will always have a bit of a frame here, which is nice. So one other thing to mention is with images, and then we'll move on to the other elements because there's a lot to cover here. But images, or sorry, anything that is higher up in the hierarchy is actually further in the background. And so a good example of that is if I were to take a new image and I put it in underneath this item panel, you'll notice that this is now covering the sword icon that we have. And that's because it is lower than our item. The sword is in the background. So if I were to just drag this and move it above it, then the sword is in fact in the foreground. So it's a little bit, that's just one thing to note, is that you need to layer your stuff. So the higher up it is in the hierarchy, the further back layer wise it will be. So if you're stacking multiple things on top of each other, they should actually be going lower and lower in the hierarchy in that order as well. So to do a little bit of cleanup here, another thing we can do is, if you remember earlier, we offset the sword icon here. So what we could actually do is we can revert that by clicking the little spiral arrow, and we can make item 1 a child of our new background image. So we'll call this item background. And then that'll allow us to add, by clicking image here, a background to this to make it look a little bit better. And so now if we move this around, the sword will come with the background as well. It'll actually follow it around. So that was quite a bit about just images, I know. There is a lot to UI, especially when first getting started. So as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. I will hop into it and explain a few other elements for UI, but I think this needs to be multiple videos. So in UI, another thing you'll want to use quite a bit is text. And so to do that, we'll have, say that we wanted to have a name underneath these items, right? So we want to put a text box underneath this item panel in this case. And once again, we would want to actually anchor it based on the panel that it's in. So it's not actually technically under this one yet. Oh, it's because I only have an items panel. I didn't even turn this into an actual individual item. So we need to make another panel real quick. So I'm just dragging that in. So this is why inheriting everything from the parent is important, because then it makes things a lot easier later. We'll change this to 200. We'll offset it. And now we're kind of back to where we were, except for now this text will actually anchor where it's supposed to. We'll name this panel item 1. We're going to anchor this to the bottom center of this panel. And actually we'll put it up at the top because there's this, it's kind of darker up there. So there, with text, there's once again the anchors. There's the same things that we already gone over in terms of like inheriting the width from and height from the parent. There's also this rotation angle. So if you rotate it 90 degrees, you can actually rotate the text. I personally haven't used that often. You can change the color of the text. And now, just recently, there was an update which allows us to have new fonts. So you can actually change the font of what the text will look like, which is really, really cool. So yeah, we could play around with that. We'll just use this one for now. And then, even though we're anchoring this text box to the top of the item, there's also a way to, we can center the text like this. We can make sure that it stays up at the top, or if we wanted to center in this box, as you can see, because our actual text box is 60 height. So if we moved it, it would always try and remain in the center of the box entirely. So that's pretty important. We could also clip text. So what that does is just like the panel stuff, if our text is too long, it won't allow text to bleed out through the text box. So that option is there. If you didn't do that, then it would just keep bleeding out past it, as you can see. So it really depends on what you're trying to get accomplished. And then also there's font size. So if we call this just sword and then we make it bigger, we can see that that is directly influencing the font size. So that pretty much summarizes how to use the text box. So then as an example, I would name it like sword name or item name. And once again, we're trying to just keep everything organized here. So that is how we would use text. And once again, if we want to make this cleaner, we could put, once again, another background, but I'm not even really sure what I'm trying to build here. I'm just using different examples. There's also a progress bar. So I don't know if it would really make much sense on this, but essentially we could just put this down at the bottom center. A progress bar is, through code, you can actually use it to fill it up, and this will show, how much progress someone is towards something usually, aka progress bar. I use it for XP bars a lot. Any sort of stat, or I haven't used it, I believe, for weapons, but we have used it for like how powerful an ability is and stuff like that. And much like all the other settings, or much like all the other UI elements, it has a lot of the same settings, but it also has this progress, which I showed you, and then there's also the ability to have the fill color change. So say we wanted to, make this yellow. That's the fill color is the progress towards it, and then the background color We could also, you know, change it as well. So don't want this to look too funky, but we'll just do that. So there we go. So to make this a little bit better, we'll actually offset this below. And we will do that. So there we go. So that's how you use a progress bar. There's also a UI scrollable panel. And so this one is also a panel like we've been using here. The difference is if there's multiple objects in it, I guess a better way is to first show you what happens with a normal panel. So we have this items panel. So let me delete this scroll panel real quick. We have this items panel. Now we have one item in it. So if I copy it and then I set its offset to 230, maybe further. So I cloned it, I moved one down, but if we clone one again and we move it further down, it goes outside of our panel entirely, as you can see. And so what a scrollable panel does is what would happen is, so one thing I should say is we didn't clip our children. So that's one thing to note, is we really should have done that in the beginning, because we never want stuff to bleed out over past what we're trying to show the player. So now, because we're clipping the children, this is, you know, getting clipped out. So the difference is if we take a scrollable panel, let me reposition this real quick, and we take this same item right here. So this one right here is in a scrollable panel. So we'll take another one, change its offset to, I believe it was 300. Take another one, we'll change its offset to 600. And as you can see, even though it's outside, this one's down here. These are in a scrollable panel, so it allows us to actually scroll. So this is a good one to use if you're trying to use a shop, or, you know, you have a quest dialog box, or you have something, you know, some sort of lore or something like that, that you know potentially can go past what this window is showing. And so this will allow the player to scroll through it. And so all in all, we've actually covered all the basics in terms of what elements are available to us. I will go over, because I believe this video is getting pretty long, I will go over in the next video how to actually start structuring your UI so you can actually code it and actually do some basics with UI through code, because that's, you know, I know code may sound scary to some of you, but honestly, it's not too hard. And I suggest learning, you know, how to use, even just getting familiar with Lua and getting familiar with the core API will get you a lot further along and being able to do a lot of your own custom stuff. And it's honestly not that hard. So in the next video, I'll definitely go over showing how to, you know, say that we had an item database and we wanted to have, you know, instead of us manually making all of these different items, we could do that. That is the easier option. But say that we wanted to have it automatically generate that stuff through code, we could do that as well. I'll also show you the basics of, one more thing. We actually skipped one. And it's actually a relatively important one, and that is button. So we'll go ahead and put a button in here real quick. We'll put it in the top right. And it looks very similar to an image currently. And in fact, we can use an image just like we were using for an image, but that's actually a button. And so what the button allows us to do is, in code, if a player hovers over it, there's a hover over event. So if someone hovers over the button, it allows us to play like a sound effect or make the button, you know, change color. There's also a click event, which allows us to, obviously if they click it, we want the UI to do something in your game. And so that allows us to do that. And then there's also a unhover event. So if someone hovered over it and then they hover off of it, there's a lot we can do with buttons. And so We're just gonna go ahead and leave this as a basic square so we could see it, and kind of go through the settings real quick. So once again, you already know the docking, the dock and the anchor and all that stuff. So this is interactable. So this is how, if this is not checked, then the button is not interactable. A player cannot click on it. And so if it is checked, then it's clickable. And this could be toggled through code. So that way, if there's certain, certain buttons that you don't want your players to be able to click on, say they're not the right level, or, the game state is in, whatever, the lobby, and you only want that button to be working during the round. That's what you would use there. We kind of already went over the image. That's basically the UI image that the button uses. And then we have button color. So this is just the color that the button is when it's just sitting there. We also have hover color. So if we wanted, we kind of discussed this. If we hover over it, I guess we'll have to play it. So we'll do that real quick. If I hover over it here, you can see that it changes to the hover over color. We have a pressed color, so same thing. If you want the button to change colors when they press it, and then also a disabled color. So if we change this to red, and then we make it not interactable, this disabled color is when the button isn't interactable. The other option you can use is if you don't want to set up 4 different colors and you don't really care for the button to change colors based on the actions that the player takes, you could also just click this and only use main button color. So it doesn't matter if it's disabled or not. It doesn't matter if they hover over it or press it. It will always remain the same color. So that is useful. The other thing is the buttons have built-in text overlay. So like, click here. And just like the text object, we can also change its font. So we could do that as well. We could change its font size. So we could change it to 30. Keep making it bigger. And then we can also change the actual font color as well. So there we have it. Now, in terms of the click mode, I actually haven't used this much. And when I say much, I mean at all. I've always used default. So there it is. So default, the mouse can, so if someone clicks and then they move it off of the button and then the release, I guess it would still count as a click. But precise, if I'm reading this correctly, and leave down in the comments below if I'm incorrect, but the mouse movement will cancel any attempts. So if I click it and then move it, then it wouldn't actually have clicked it. That's how I'm reading it. I'm not really sure about that. If I get an update on information on that, I will definitely let everyone know. But I believe this should cover it. I know this UI looks like a mess, but hopefully it was helpful to kind of understand the elements that are available to us. A quick recap, like I said, always make sure that your UI is in client context, because so far I haven't had a situation where I've ever wanted UI to be changed by multiple people. I basically have always, in every game I've seen, client UI is always in client context, so I just made it the habit of doing so. The container is a needed object. If you just have these panels floating in your hierarchy and it's not underneath the container, the UI will not work. Use panels to separate your different elements, especially if you're going to have multiple things layered on top of each other like we have here. Make sure that element is under a panel. You'll definitely thank me later, because it just makes things so much easier to be able to move this one panel around and everything underneath it to move with it. And then also making sure that your anchor points are set up correctly. So if something, for example, is going to be in the top left, don't move it to the top left, or for, I guess, better examples, if it's going to be in the bottom right, don't move it to the bottom right if its anchor is top left, because once again, I guess it looks fine there because it's actually a child of the parent there, but things could get messed up. So it's always better. So yeah, I don't want to mess it up. Just trust me. You want to make sure that you try and get the anchor point and the dock point relatively where you want that element to stay. And then from there, use offset to position it where you actually want it to be. Let's see what else. Yeah, like I said, you can have panels within panels. Anything that is further up in the hierarchy when it comes to images and text, for each panel, it's further and further back in terms of layers. And so as you're stacking things on top of each other, if you want text to be in the foreground of the background, it needs to be lower in the hierarchy. So the lowest element underneath that panel. And I believe that pretty much covers it. So, you know, as always, hopefully this was helpful. I had a lot of you asking about UI. I've worked with UI a lot. Honestly, it's something that is slightly difficult in Core at the moment. They're always doing improvements, and with what you learned in this video, it will make it a lot easier to use than how I learned how to do it, which was not knowing any of this and messing up quite a bit. So like I said, you know, really get familiar with panels. Your first few UI, I know I talked about making a video on making stuff dynamic. Honestly, I would just kind of mess around and learn the design elements of UI. I'm not saying by any means that this is a great design, but just kind of learning how to position things, making sure that, you know, stuff actually looks good in multiple resolutions. You know, I do that just by quickly, as you've seen me do it a few times in this video, is just I just drag the viewport around just to see if everything stays where it should and then scales properly. If you start to do that and you see things, you know, moving outside of where it is, then something is incorrect. You probably should go check your anchor points and make sure that your children are underneath the right panels and everything. Without blabbing too much, like I said, I will go into further videos because there's a lot. Like, UI is an extremely important thing in your game, and there is a lot to it. So I will do a video focused fully on the coding side of this. I didn't want to compile this all into one video because it's already as massive as it is. So once again, if you have any questions or comments, please do them, leave them in the comments down below. If you liked this video and you want more like it, please hit that thumbs up and please hit that subscribe button because it really motivates me to make more content and help all of you create awesome games. I look forward to your creations, and I'll catch you next time, Titans.